Welcome to the LACNETS podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Yen. I'm the LACNETS Director of Programs and Outreach, as well as a caregiver and advocate for my husband who is living with NET. This is part 2 of a 2-part series where we reprise Navigating Clinical Trials, Expectations versus Realities with Taymeyah Al-Toubah, NET researcher from Moffitt Cancer Center. This was previously broadcast on August 19, 2023 as a LACNETS monthly educational webinar. This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Please discuss your questions and concerns with your physician.
Well, Taymeyah, we're so glad you could be with us today to address the practical aspects of clinical trials. You know, there's a lot of information out there in the patient education space about clinical trials and the trials that are out there, but yet there still is a lot maybe that is yet to be answered, the practical aspects of it. Questions that people might ask, the questions that people had that they don't even know that they had that you named, misconceptions, and the big picture concept. So we really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And so, Taymeyah, you have boots on the ground experience, coordinating a lot of clinical trials, doing a lot of research yourself. And we really appreciate you helping us focus on the accessing of clinical trials, the how, the operations, the logistics. So today's focus is more on that and not so much on the actual treatments or the sequencing. So let's just jump in the first question. Why enroll in a clinical trial versus getting the same treatment, maybe off-label? Some treatments we could do that, or going to a different country or another place to get the same treatment.
That's a very valid and real question, I think, for a lot of patients. I think one thing we have to think about is the clinical trials are a controlled environment that we have to treat a patient with a new drug. And so that answer is going to be different depending on the patient's case. So in some cases, let's say it's a newer drug where we're not 100% sure that this is the right area to give it in. I'll use an example of cabozantinib. That's a trial that's ongoing in a clinical trial. It's FDA approved in other cancers, has good data in a phase 2 trial in neuroendocrine tumors. So you'll see where that may be a drug that if for whatever reason you don't meet the criteria for a trial, your doctor may feel is appropriate to give you in an off-label use. Or like PRRT, when we had finished all the trials and we knew that it was probably going to get FDA approved, there was so much data out there, then it made sense to maybe send you to another country and get that treatment. Those are scenarios where it makes sense. But other scenarios where the drugs are newer, we don't really know, at that point, you're kind of treating yourself in a way and not really listening to the experts and to the data that exists out there when you go and try to force your hand to get another treatment in another country or an off-label use. So it just depends on the scenario of when that's a good idea and when it's not. There's a lot less monitoring too.
So this is a practical question. Someone's currently waiting to hear a decision if they're accepted into a trial. What's the average wait time to a decision, and who makes the decision? Is it the pharmaceutical company, the screening doctor, or both?
That also depends on the type of trial that you're enrolling on. So some trials require that your images at baseline be uploaded to a portal, and then a blinded radiologist from the company actually has to review and confirm that your images meet criteria. So in that case, the decision is twofold. Your doctor obviously has to say you meet criteria, but then the pharmaceutical company may have a second set of eyes that has to verify that information. And if they disagree, there's a chance that you would not be eligible. The average wait time to a decision, that again depends on the nature of the study. So if there's biopsies involved, if there's outside testing involved, reviews of scans, things like that, it can take a few weeks. I have yet to see a trial that has more than a, say, 2 to 3 week wait time for a decision. And in those 2 to 3 weeks, there definitely should be communication from your study team. So if you're basically not hearing anything for several weeks on end, that's a problem. So I would definitely reach out to your primary contact on that. The only studies that have a really long wait time are things like CAR-T trials, which we don't have many in the NET space, but maybe you're on a phase 1 trial or something like that. Those involve some HLA testing up front. You may have to have some induction chemotherapy, things like that. So that wait time may be a little bit longer just due to the nature of the trial, but that would be disclosed up front.
Thank you. That's helpful. And here's another logistical question. When I reach out to one location for clinical trial and another closer or more convenient location opens up, can I switch sites?
Most of the time, the answer is yes. You can't switch back and forth often, but you can typically switch once. The easiest trials to switch back and forth with, and the easiest trials in general for transferring sites, are usually government protocols. There's a really clean system involved. The data gets very easily transmitted from one place to the next. So that process is pretty seamless. But for the most part, yes, you just have to wait for your teams to communicate and figure out the logistics.
And would this apply also to PRT related trials?
Yeah, it does for the most part. I can't speak to the trial, like, for example, the NETTER-1 trial. I don't remember what that was like, to be honest, offhand, but I know that for the ongoing trials right now, it is an option. The only thing you have to think about is I wouldn't transfer just from consent to starting. I would wait until you've at least had a dosing date set and then your subsequent doses set. So if you know that you're definitely going to want to transfer for a PRRT trial, the earlier you can tell your team, the better, because sometimes the manufacturing is allocated in certain places. We might be able to receive 2 or 3 doses a week. And let's say you want to transfer to a site in Texas or in Kentucky, they may already have 2 to 3 doses allocated for the same weeks that you are receiving treatment, in which case they probably won't be able to accommodate a 4th patient onto their schedule in that same time frame. So either you would have to shift your treatment a little bit to accommodate receipt of the drug and the nuclear medicine availability, or you may have to stay on treatment in the site that you were enrolled at to begin with, and then just transfer when you get to follow up, for example. So all your scans and labs and things like that could be done later.
Okay. And so I hear you saying that each site has certain number of doses allocated to the site.
Mm-hmm.
That's helpful. And what if many people do have to travel for treatments and for trials? If I need to travel for a clinical trial, is it possible to have that consultation appointment the same day as starting the treatment?
Starting the treatment, I'd say no. Definitely need some time in between. There's a lot of moving parts, even for trials where we have the drug in-house and it's not something that we need to order. So the screening visit alone will, at minimum, have scans, labs, and a visit with a provider. You have to wait for the results of all that. And pretty much every single center has to have a second check of eligibility, where you can't just sign off on eligibility with the doctor and send the patient down to infusion without somebody taking a look at that. So at minimum, you're going to need to do all of that. I'd say at least a few days to weeks most of the time it takes before screening and starting. And most places will not screen a patient on the same day that they come in for the initial consultation if they've never met the patient before. If I have a new patient coming into me, they're interested in a trial, we have to get eyes on them. The records alone don't tell the full picture. Your records may say that you're feeling well and you're doing great and your labs look great. And when you come in that day, well, that picture is very subjective in a note. And so when that physician who's actually administering the drug sees you, they can tell you, I know what this drug does to patients. I know the kind of side effects. I'm seeing you now. I don't think it's a good idea to do this. And so that conversation may change too. At minimum, I'd say a few weeks most of the time if I've never met you before.
Thanks for that clarification. And then let's talk a little bit about costs.
Mm-hmm.
What costs are there for clinical trials? Will there be a cost for the treatment, scans, labs?
That depends on the type of trial. If it's a trial that is pharmaceutical funded or government funded, we'll just break those two down. So government funded protocols have a lot less resources, a lot fewer funds. Most of the time, the coverage for those trials is dictated based on the Medicare coverage guidelines. There's not extra money that gets sent just to cover expenses that may not be approved or may have a high copay with insurance. Most of the government protocols will cover the drug for the most part. The administration of the drug is almost universally covered by insurance or the patient or invoiced that way. Labs, it depends. So if it's a study-specific lab that you wouldn't otherwise get on a normal treatment, then that's usually covered by the trial. But if it's a standard of care lab, scans, those are typically covered by insurance or invoiced to insurance at least. For pharmaceutical studies, run studies, there's sometimes more resources in that. And so you may find that they may offer to cover a lot more in those cases than government protocols or an investigator-initiated study, which is a study that's only being run at 1 or 2 sites and funded by the institution that developed that science, basically. And so that's something to definitely ask up front. I'd say most of the time, at minimum, treatment is covered. The only time the treatment's not covered is if we have a randomized trial, for example, where one arm is standard of care and one arm is investigational. Usually the standard of care will be covered by insurance or invoiced to insurance. We had a case last week where we were consenting a patient and I had the doctor write for the standard of care potentially at the screening visit because we want to know what that insurance coverage is going to look like. How long is it going to take for that to come back? Take a while for them to approve it, for your pharmacy to be able to fill it, things like that. Just depends.
And you mentioned the standard of care. Can you talk a little bit about that? There are those trials where it says standard of care and it could be like a few different options. Who decides that?
Your doctor will decide that after a discussion with you. In most cases, if it's an investigator choice, that's how the conversation will happen. If it's just one standard of care option, then obviously we'll just go with whatever that trial requires. And the decision's usually based on how you're feeling at the time, what treatment is appropriate in that sequence that they would have otherwise offered you other than the trial. So that's typically how that conversation will go.
Thanks for clarifying. And if there are costs for the trial, how do I find help to help with those costs, including lodging and travel?
Your coordinator should be your primary touch point for that. Your social worker also can help. If the trial covers a lot of things, the coordinator should let you know up front. Most of the time, if the trial's covering, you'll want to go through your coordinator, or some institutions have like a lodging coordinator or travel coordinator in addition to your clinical research coordinator, who you would communicate with. And you want to make sure that you're setting that up the way that they ask you to, because if you don't, then you may be stuck with bills. Then the reimbursement process takes forever. That's one of the biggest pain points, honestly, in the research world is if a patient covers their hotel and the trial pays for it, but there was another mechanism we should have used, that reimbursement can take months, sometimes years, to be honest. If it's not covered by the trial, which is the majority of the trials, your institutions will likely have a lodging coordinator or a social work team. We usually have contracts with hotels in the area. If you meet a certain financial criteria, then there may be opportunities that the hospital has. So I'd start with the coordinator and they'll be able to direct you from there.
That's hopeful. Hopefully there are resources. Let's talk about side effects and symptoms. If I experience symptoms or issues while on a clinical trial, who do I contact and then what happens?
So who you contact will differ from institution to institution. So some places will have a clinical research coordinator to handle logistics and then a nurse to handle all side effects. Others will have your coordinator be your primary point of contact, and then they will communicate out to everybody else. So you'll want to ask that during the consent process, who am I supposed to contact, and stay consistent. Because if you reach out to two people, the wires may cross. So if that clinic is not used to trial questions and you call the hotline, that nurse is just going to deal with it like any other treatment, not keeping in mind that you're on a clinical trial. So figure out what process your institution has, and then from there, they'll notify you of what to do. If it's emergent, they'll advise you to go to a hospital or bring you in. If it's not, they'll figure out some sort of touch point schedule. So do this and I'll call you back in 24 hours and we'll go from there. They'll communicate with your doctor whenever you have a side effect. And then you may not hear directly from your doctor every single time you call with a symptom, but know that they are communicating with your doctor every single time that happens, and they'll tell them what to do. So if, let's say, you call and you say, hey, I'm vomiting, but it's not enough that the doctor says you need to go to the hospital, they'll probably call in a script for something and tell me to check in with you again after the thing's resolved. And we go from there. But definitely report everything as it happens. Don't wait for things to accumulate too long, especially in the first few weeks.
Thanks. If I'm in a clinical trial, for example, receiving alpha PRRT and end up having surgery for some reason, does that then remove you from that trial?
That also depends on what the surgery was for, where in the process it happened. Let's say you fell and broke your foot and you needed surgery to fix that. Most of the time, trials won't kick you off a trial for having a non-cancer related injury that requires attention. There are guidelines for how long we have to delay treatments in between to safely be able to give you the drug again where it still is going to be beneficial. So those are things that might need to be tweaked when it comes to like delays resulting from a surgery. But if you're on a clinical trial, I'd say almost universally and need a surgery to address a cancer progression event, not necessarily cancer complication. Most of the time that removes you from a trial. Every trial is a little bit different. So some trials will allow, let's say you have a really painful bone lesion and we want to remove that, but everything else is looking good and stable. They may not say that you have to be removed from the trial. Radiation is sometimes allowed for pain reasons, things like that. And sometimes it's very cut and dry. If you need to go to the OR, you need to have radiation for whatever reason, you do have to come off. It's something to address as things come up for sure. But if you are going to need surgery, communicate that before just doing it at another institution. You don't want to end up stuck.
And similarly, related to that, how would it be determined if this is a response to the treatment versus the tumor swelling from inflammations and tumors dying off?
That will depend on the imaging and your symptoms. We define progression and response in a number of ways. Objectively, we look at your CT scans, most of the time CT or MRI, because that's the easiest to actually calculate size of tumors and number of tumors. We have PET scans that can show us activity of tumors as well to an extent. And so your doctor can look at things in a multifactorial way. Sometimes we see the scans tell a picture, but then your side effects tell a completely different picture. And that's where we'll do a little bit more digging. If your scans are looking a little bit worse, for example, maybe there's not a lot of new disease. There's nothing new, really. It's just your tumors look a little bit bigger, but you feel 1,000 times better. You have more energy. Your labs are looking better, things like that. That would be a scenario that's, okay, maybe the tumors are just swelling and we're actually seeing a response. So maybe we give it a little bit more time. Maybe we do another type of scan, whether that be doing a PET scan earlier than needed, depending on the type of treatment that we're doing. And then the type of therapy you're on will also dictate if that's even something that happens. If you're on a drug like, let's say, Afinitor or Sutent or cabozantinib, pills like that, or even chemotherapy, it's unlikely that you're going to have tumor swelling happen during treatment. And most likely, even if we're having that discrepancy and we're seeing a growth in tumors, we're more likely to just trust the scans than the symptoms. And then when you have things like immunotherapy, which is known to inflame everything potentially, and same thing with radiation-based therapies like PRRT, that's where we look at that picture a little bit more closely sometimes and give it a little bit more time, where it's safer to give a little bit more time.
And when you say a little bit more time, how long would you typically wait for scanning?
For immunotherapy, typically, if it's within the first 6 months that we're giving a treatment and you see that inflammation potentially or tumor growth, but everything else is looking good, we'll usually repeat scans 4 to 6 weeks from that first scan that shows progression and confirm or negate the results. So if we do that scan within 4 to 6 weeks and things are still stable or they've gone back to a little bit smaller, then we continue on. If they're looking worse, we usually will change course. And if something obviously comes up in between, then we make a decision earlier. For PRRT, there's not really an established guideline or number of weeks that we wait or don't wait. It's a little bit more up to a multidisciplinary conversation between your nuclear medicine doctor, the radiologist, and then your treating physician. And also looking back at your history with how your disease has presented itself. Sometimes trials will be very cut and dry about this too, even if the doctor would be willing to give things a little bit more time. That's also sometimes where the trial will decide for us if we can continue or not. But if we're talking about where there is leeway, it can take sometimes a few weeks to make a decision like that.
Yeah, so balancing the protocol and then also some degree of looking at the whole picture and patience.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about scans, and particularly I know a lot of people are interested in PRRT. What scans are you doing to assess this?
Baseline for PRRT, you definitely need a PET dotatate scan, whether that's a copper or a gallium-based PET. Octria scans, which we don't really do anymore, are not sufficient to make a decision about PRRT up front. And then a CT or MRI, depending on the best thing for you. So if you have an iodine allergy, we'll typically do MRIs of the abdomen and pelvis with EOVIS contrast. That helps us see the liver tumors better, which most neuroendocrine tumors progress in the liver. And then if you're doing a CT scan, it's usually a 3-phase abdomen. So we're looking at multiple phases of the contrast in the abdomen. And then we'll do a pelvis. And then we always scan on trials, usually the chest as well, whether non-contrast of the chest or if we're doing a CT with contrast. In between, I'd say it's rare to do extra PET scans while you're on PRRT. We usually do PET scans at the end of the PRRT treatment, about a year from your baseline. So there's usually a year between each PET scan that we do. Otherwise, you can see a lot of inflammation on those scans. Very few protocols have more frequent PET scans. Sometimes you'll see renal scans that we have to do as well for PRRT. So we need to make sure your kidneys are functioning appropriately because your body excretes that radiation through the urine and other bodily fluids. And so the kidneys are a primary place of potential toxicity or side effects there. So we want to make sure that's functioning so you can get rid of that radiation and it doesn't get backed up into your system. So those are things that you might see. People with a lot of bone mets, this might not be on trial, but your doctor may choose to do a bone scan as well, just to better picture your disease in that sense. And then brain MRIs only if you have known brain metastases or a suspicion for brain met.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we can talk a little bit more about alpha PRRT. I know that's a hot topic. Let's talk about the trial names. How can we tell the difference between drugs in the trials based on the trial names? I've been told not all immunotherapy are the same.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll start with the immunotherapy part of this because immunotherapy, while alpha PRRT is kind of the hot thing now, a few years ago, immunotherapy was the really hot thing. And I don't think it's gone away. I think we're just trying to figure out how to use it appropriately in neuroendocrine tumors. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the future. But immunotherapy is not just your typical, we hear Keytruda, we hear Opdivo, we hear Yervoy. Those are the ipilimumab, nivolumab, pembrolizumab. Those are the hot ones that we think about. There's other types of immunotherapy, not necessarily the same class of those drugs. Those are checkpoint inhibitors. But there's other immunotherapy. Bispecific antibodies fall under that in a different way. CAR T therapy falls under that. So those are other types of immunotherapy that we're looking at. There are also other drugs called monoclonal antibodies, which fall into that realm. So it's important to know what the actual drug is that you're going to be receiving. And the way to figure that out as a patient is when you're looking up a trial in clinicaltrials.gov, find where they list the actual name of the drug. So they're required to do that. You'll see the actual chemical name of the drug, and that way you can Google and figure out what exactly that is. That will also help you figure out if you're eligible for a future trial once you've gotten a drug. Because most of the time, if it's an immunotherapy trial, it'll have some sort of exclusion on what you could have gotten in the past. So that's something good to pay attention to. And then the trial names, they come up with all these fancy names to make it a little bit easier to remember. So you'll hear Action 1, you'll hear Alphamedics, you'll hear Cabinet, things like that. Those are good trigger words to remember, okay, this is the trial that everybody's talking about. But really just look at the title of the trial and break down what the actual drug and type of drug is. Don't get too hung up on those names to make things a little bit shorter for everybody. Ask your doctor not to communicate that way sometimes because it's easy for them to just shoot those names out because that's what they're hearing in meetings. That's what they're using a lot. But definitely the title of the trial will always have the name of the drug in it. And then the breakdown of the drugs in the trial will help you figure that out.
Thank you. There's a lot of names and words out there, so that helps clarify. And you touched on this a little bit, but can you discuss the alpha PRRT trials? We know you've done some coordination and work in this, and which ones are out there? Where are they, and what's the eligibility?
Alpha PRRT refers to the class of PRRT. So PRRT is peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. That includes Lutathera, which is FDA approved. That is a beta emitter. There are several different types of radiation, but in this case, we have two different types of radiation that we're exploring that is attached to a somatostatin analog. So you have beta, which would be lutetium dotatate, lutetium dotatalk. So those would be like AAA's Lutathera or ITM's lutetium dotatalk that's in trials. So if you are on the COMPETE or COMPOSE trial, that's where you're looking at another beta emitter. And then we have the class of alpha emitters. So it's a different type of radiation. The particles for the radiation are larger. So the way that PRRT works is we have radiation attached to a somatostatin analog, which is similar to the sandostatin or lanreotide that most of us are getting. And so what it does is it delivers targeted radiation to the tumors. And so it attaches to the tumors, gives that radiation, and that's where the alpha and beta differ. So beta, alpha is the radiation component. And those can be different types too. So you'll hear actinium, you'll hear lead. Those are both alpha emitting particles. And then you have lutetium or yttrium, which are beta emitting. So you hear those as well. So right now there's two main clinical trials that are ongoing with alpha PRRT. And so that's the Raise Bio trial with the actinium-225. And then you have the lead-212 that is being run by AlphaMedix or RadioMedix. So those are the two trials that are ongoing. The Raise Bio trial is a phase 3 trial. It's for patients who have already progressed on PRRT in the past with Lutathera or any lutetium-based treatment. And the AlphaMedix trial had two arms. They've completed the naive arm, which was for patients who had never received PRRT at all. And now they're hopefully will be enrolling soon for patients who have already received PRRT in the past. The Raise Bio trial is open at a lot of sites, and they're opening several more across the country. So there will definitely be more opportunity and way more slots on the actinium trial than there will be on the lead trial. The difference in criteria and the difference in trial design is the lead-based trial, so the AlphaMedix trial, that's only open right now at 4 places. So those are the places that the lead trial is open. The Raise Bio trial is open, like I said, almost everywhere. The criteria for the Raise Bio trial, at this point, we're in phase 3, so it's randomized. So patients can either get the actinium or they can get the standard of care, and Raise Bio has it set where the standard is Sutent, Afinitor, or high dose of either lanreotide or octreotide. And they do have crossover written into that protocol. The lead trial, I think the reason that a lot of patients are really trying to get into those is that trial is everybody gets a drug. So there's no randomization on that one. There are very few slots, though. I think the entire protocol is written for about 34 slots total for the refractory arm. So it's very hard to find a slot for that one. I'm sure we have a wait list. Every other place probably also has a wait list. And then beyond that, I'd say other key differences are the Raise Bio trial has a few more visits in between. There are more EKGs, some labs. There's some optional studies that you can opt into or out of. The AlphaMedix trial is a little bit more simple in design. There are lots of labs, I'm going to tell you, on both trials. You're basically getting stuck every 2 weeks. They're monitoring you pretty closely on these. Scan schedules are a little bit different on both. The follow-up is a little bit different on both, but for the most part, it's two very similar drugs that we're looking at.
So the trials, which one, if any, would also include grade 3?
Yeah, so the lead trial would include grade 3. Raise Bio's grade 1 and grade 2.
So you're saying with both the trials right now, it's only for people who have previously gotten PRRT. And can you also define refractory when you say PRRT refractory?
PRRT refractory is a patient who has received PRRT with Lutathera and has then had some response or stability of disease and then later progressed after the fact. The criteria for the Raise Bio trial is a little bit more defined on what progression is and what the period of time is. The lead trial is a little bit more lenient.
So I guess sometimes people wonder, well, what if Lutathera didn't work for me? Will I still be eligible for one of the alpha trials?
It depends on what you mean by didn't work. So if it didn't work at all, meaning you never had any stable scan after treatment, you would not be eligible for the Raise Bio trial. And I believe most people would not recommend it for the lead either if you had absolutely no benefit. If you had benefit for at least 6 months, most of the time a year that people are looking for, but for purposes of the criteria, it's 6 months that you have to have shown at least stable disease. And then you later progress, that would still mean that it had some activity and that you could explore the alpha emitters.
And what's the minimum number and the maximum number of Lutathera that you could have previously gotten to be eligible?
I don't have it right in front of me, but it's 4. You can't have had more than 4. I don't know that they allow for you to have had less either if you came off for side effects. I think if you, for whatever reason, only had access to 2 doses or something like that, that may be something that we could discuss, but you definitely can't have had more than 4 doses.
And what if someone comes to a center like Moffitt and you have both trials open? How is that decided if you're going to go for the actinium trial or the lead trial?
There's some other minor criteria. We're not going to get into that in too much detail, but, labs, things like that might dictate why you would be a better fit for one or the other. The other thing is availability of slots and when you actually need the treatment. So if you're able to wait a little bit longer and, wait for, let's say, a lead slot, and that is what we're looking for, then maybe we'd go that way. The other thing is the prior therapies that you've gotten. So let's say you've already gotten Sutent, Afinitor, and high dose of an SSA, then it's unlikely that we'd recommend that we re-challenge those drugs. And so maybe we would hold out for a slot on the other trial. But if you haven't received Afinitor or Sutent, if both are appropriate for you, and then a higher dose of the SSA, the RAISE Bio trial will maximize your treatment options in a way. It gives us time to figure out, one, how should we sequence these drugs? That's kind of the point of these trials. In another way as well, do we give the Afinitor or Sutent first and then do the PRRT because we have that option in that trial? Or do we give them in the reverse order? That's more the direction you'd head in, especially if you still have lots of options.
Thanks. I'm sure you get this question a lot. What happens if the platelets are low during a PRRT trial or just in general during PRRT? What can be done?
Depends on how low, right? So sometimes it's at a point where it's low, but not low enough to give you platelets or give you blood or anything like that. Depends on why the platelets are low, if there's another contributing cause. Most of the time, if they're low, but not too low to give treatment, you just receive treatment if that was safe. If they're too low, there's certain cutoffs in the protocols for how low we can go before we have to delay treatment. There's a maximum amount of time that we can delay before recovery while we're waiting for recovery before we retreat. And so if it takes too long, you may not be able to continue on treatment. Oftentimes, what will happen is if they're low, we'll wait for it to recover, and the criteria will also be to reduce the subsequent doses. You may get either 75% or 50% of the radiation dose at subsequent treatments. And that's provided that it's recovered to a criteria that's safe to continue to give you.
And sometimes patients worry about reducing the dose and what it might mean in terms of, are they getting the full treatment and the full impact from that?
I completely understand that. But what I will say is if we have to reduce to a point where it's not therapeutic and you're not getting any benefit, then we would stop and move on to something else. The danger of giving a full dose when your bone marrow is already impacted or some other lab criteria or a side effect is going on. The danger of giving you a full dose of a drug when we've already exhausted that is that risk is a lot higher than the potential benefit of getting the full dose. And this applies not just for PRRT, it applies for any drug. I'd rather a consistent lower dose where you're still getting active treatment throughout this time than a higher dose that we have to give once a month and then we have to keep skipping a few weeks every single time. This applies to pills, chemo, immunotherapy, things like that.
Yeah, that's helpful. And speaking of PRRT maybe not working, what other options are there if PRRT didn't get the result intended?
That depends on where you are in your treatment cycle, the primary site of disease, what treatments you've already gotten, what trials besides that are available. PRRT is one other drug in our arsenal of drugs. A lot of times we think of it as a separate class, and it is a different type of treatment, but it is another systemic therapy that we have in our toolbox of all drugs. The same way, if Afinitor didn't work and we move on to PRRT, it's the same concept. So if PRRT doesn't work, depends on where your progression is and why it didn't work. So if you're only progressing in the liver, you might look at liver-directed therapies. If you're progressing everywhere, either another trial or other FDA-approved drugs that exist for your primary site of disease. So just think of it as one other tool.
Thanks. So if I'm getting a treatment through a clinical trial that's working for me, how long can I stay on that drug? And will I be able to stay on it even when the trial's closed or if that arm of the trial's closed?
That depends on how the protocol is written. So some trials are written where as long as it's working, you continue and the company's obligated to provide that drug to you in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes if the drug goes to FDA approval, then they will close the trial completely and they'll force everybody off, and then your doctor will have to prescribe it through your insurance. When we talk about closed, sometimes we're referring to closure of accrual. So it means that we've put all the patients on that can go on in the slots that we had, but it doesn't mean that the operation of the trial doesn't continue on. I had a patient who was the last person standing on the pazopanib trial. She was on for almost 10 years. If the drug is working for you and the trial is written that way, you'll continue.
Thank you for clarifying that word close. I think that can be scary. And I know that happened when that lead trial, that arm closed too. Some people are like, does that mean I stopped my treatment?
No.
Are there any clinical trials that would address the difficult treatment of NETs peritoneal carcinomatosis?
I wish. That's one of those things that's very unique and hard to put into an objective clinical trial. It's more of a case-by-case basis. It's important that you go to doctors who have experience seeing this. If you have a lot of peritoneal disease and it's limiting your ability to get treatments, or your lifestyle is just very difficult as a result of that, make sure that you ask around and talk to somebody who has experience, or are referred to a doctor who can address that. But a trial just for that, no, not at this time.
Are there any trials or interest in looking at the efficacy of neoadjuvant or adjuvant treatment for NETs other than pancreatic NETs?
That's something that also we have to think about the biology of this disease and when these diseases are usually diagnosed. So the reason that there are neoadjuvant adjuvant treatments in trial form for pancreatic NET right now is because this is an area that we catch earlier on than others. So most small bowel neuroendocrine tumors are diagnosed when the patient's already metastatic, so that doesn't really apply at that point. There are neoadjuvant and adjuvant treatments for NETs of all primary diseases in guidelines. That's something that we don't talk about a lot on the patient-facing side. There are guidelines and there are trials, and sometimes there are guidelines that don't need a separate trial to establish a set way that we do things. If a patient comes to us with a stage 1, stage 2 rectal neuroendocrine tumor, small bowel neuroendocrine tumor, your tumor board and your doctor are going to have a plan in place depending on the pathologic features, what the grade is of the tumor, how much it's invading a certain area, things like that. They're going to have a plan in place for neoadjuvant, adjuvant treatment in those cases based on literature. That's where a lot of our retrospective data comes into play. That's where a lot of just experience over time with this cancer and other cancers. We can use applications from other cancers in our space here. While there may not be a trial, a formal way of looking at that, it's usually because it's not feasible. It's going to take decades to enroll a certain amount of patients. And by the time we publish, it's meaningless. We would have accomplished the same thing otherwise. But we absolutely do treat adjuvantly and neoadjuvantly for all types of tumors.
Yeah, thank you. And this is a really practical question. How do I find out the results of the clinical trial? And will I find out the impact of my participation and how my participation contributed to science?
You will. Your name and your information won't be published directly. So you're not going to be able to see, hey, I'm patient, 15, and I see exactly my data out there. That's never going to happen. And if it does, that's kind of a problem. But the results of the clinical trial are all published in whatever journal that study decides to publish in, but they will be posted and required to be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. The thing I will say is it takes a bit of time for it to populate on there. But if you go on PubMed and just search the trial number that you have, if it's published, it'll be on there. And the way that you can look that up from your consent form, keep that consent form or scan it in when you get a copy of it. There should be an NCT number or another number identifier that the sponsor has in there. And that's what I would use to Google or search on PubMed the study that you're looking at, because the results will be tagged to that.
That's really helpful. And so we'll just end with this final question. We know, Taymeyah, that you have a long career ahead of you as a clinician and researcher. So I'm curious what clinical trial or advances in the NET field you're most excited about.
One of the big treatment advances that I'm excited for is the CAR-T space. I'm really interested to see where that goes. I know Penn's already getting their trial started, and we're hopefully getting close to at least starting the trial process for the drug that we've developed along with Italy at Moffitt. That's a space that I'm really excited about. I think that has probably the highest chance of getting people into remission, and that's something that is always a goal. Immunotherapy in general, I'm very excited about, but that's one treatment. The other thing is, I wouldn't say that we already know this answer, but I really hope that more effort goes into figuring out the best way to treat and control poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinomas. There's a lot of other things I'm excited for, but those I think are two unmet needs. We don't have a lot in the poorly differentiated space. Those are very, very aggressive. And by the time you're treating them, most of the time things are pretty bad. Immunotherapy, I think, has a big potential to tap into that space. It's just figuring out exactly what we need to target to get that to work in a higher percentage of patients.
Well, thank you so much for this time. If you have any closing comments or words of hope you want to leave the community, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to interact with everyone. And, this NET space is one of the most incredible patient populations that I've ever met. I'd say keep doing what you guys are doing. You really are your best advocates and really prove that time and time again, and just keep showing up for each other and for yourselves. And hopefully whatever you guys need, I'd love to hear about so that we can push forward. We need that feedback to be able to figure out what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. So that's the only thing I would ask of, is more communication that's directed to us. But thank you so much for giving me this time, Lisa.
Thanks for listening to the LACNETS podcast. Go to our website, lacnets.org/podcast for episode transcripts and resources. We want to thank our podcast supporters, Ipsen, ITM, Crinetics, Curium, and Boehringer Ingelheim. For more information about neuroendocrine cancer, go to www.lacnets.org. LACNETS depends on donations to bring you programs such as this podcast. Please consider making a donation at lacnets.org/donate.